Welcome to this deep dive. We're jumping straight into the Karen Reed case today. It's a really complex legal situation unfolding up in Massachusetts,
Yeah.
and it's certainly captured a lot of public attention.
It really has.
And just a reminder, as we record this in early May 2025, this is very much an ongoing case. So it's absolutely crucial to remember that Karen Reed is presumed innocent. That's fundamental.
Absolutely. Presumed innocent. Our goal here isn't, to reach a verdict ourselves.
Right.
It's more about digging into the information that's out there publicly, trying to understand the different layers and, frankly, the complexities involved.
Exactly. And the core question we're really looking at in this deep dive is, what actually happened to Boston police officer John O'Keefe? His death back on January 29th, 2022 in Canton, Massachusetts. Was it a terrible accident? Or, as some suggest, was it part of a cover-up? Maybe something else entirely. The narratives presented are just so incredibly different. That's what makes it so, well, compelling.
The contrast is, it's stark. You've got the prosecution on one side painting this picture of, a night out that just ended tragically, almost accidentally.
Right, that initial story from the prosecution. It starts with Reed and O'Keefe out at bars, then heading over towards Brian Albert's house, who's another Boston police officer on Fairview Road.
Okay.
The prosecution says they got there around 12:05 a.m., and their claim is that Reed dropped O'Keefe off, didn't go in herself, but then fatally hit him with her black Lexus SUV doing like a three-point turn.
And he wasn't found for hours, right? Unresponsive in the snow.
Exactly. Hours later.
Yeah.
But then the defense comes forward with a narrative that's, well, it's a world apart.
Completely different. They argue O'Keefe did go inside that house.
Yes. Their claim is he went in, some kind of altercation happened inside, and then his body was moved outside later. They're essentially saying Karen Reed is being framed.
And that this frame-up might even involve a cover-up, potentially with law enforcement involvement.
It's a huge allegation. Okay, so maybe let's start by unpacking the prosecution side of things first.
Yeah, okay. To really get their argument, you need the context of that night.
Right.
Late January 28th, going into the 29th, 2022. Canton, Massachusetts. It was freezing cold, a serious snowstorm hitting the area.
That's a critical piece of the scene, the weather. Bitter cold, heavy snow.
Definitely. So the prosecution's timeline, as you said, tracks them from the bars to Albert's place around 12:45 a.m. And their key point, Reed drops them off. She doesn't enter the house.
Right.
And their case really hangs on a few key pieces of evidence they presented. First off, these pieces of a broken taillight found near O'Keefe's body. They argue these fragments match Karen Reed's black Lexus SUV, and her vehicle did have damage to its taillight later.
That's very tangible, yeah. And then there are statements Reed herself supposedly made right after O'Keefe was found. Things like expressing worry she might have hit something.
Like asking, did I hit him? That kind of thing. And also apparently mentioning damage to her SUV. Then you have the medical examiner's findings. The ME reported injuries consistent with being hit by a vehicle. Although, obviously, hypothermia from being out in that extreme cold was also a major factor.
A huge factor, surely. And the prosecution also pointed to Reed's blood alcohol level. They said it was tested hours later and was still allegedly over the legal limit.
Right, supporting the OUI operating under the influence part of the charges.
And finally, I think they mentioned some voicemails or texts between Reed and O'Keefe earlier that night, which they felt were maybe incriminating in some way.
Yeah. So you put all that together, and that's the basis for the charges against her. Second-degree murder, manslaughter while operating under the influence, and leaving the scene of an accident causing injury and death.
It presents a narrative, a sequence of events leading to O'Keefe's death caused by Reed's actions behind the wheel.
A pretty direct cause and effect argument from their side.
But, like we said, the defense sees it completely differently. Let's switch gears and dive into their counter-narrative now.
Okay. The absolute core of the defense argument is, well, it's a frame-up. Plain and simple.
Right.
They're saying John O'Keefe's death wasn't an accident involving Reed's car. They allege people inside Brian Albert's house were involved, and that the investigation itself was biased, maybe even manipulated evidence to point the finger at Karen Reed.
So their timeline diverges right at the doorstep. They insist O'Keefe did go into 34 Fairview Road that night.
Correct. And that inside some kind of fight and altercation broke out. They've suggested it involved O'Keefe, possibly Brian Albert, maybe his nephew Colin Albert, who was apparently there, Jennifer McCabe.
Brian Albert's sister-in-law, right?
Yes, her. And maybe others, potentially people with law enforcement ties. That's part of their implication.
And what are they using to back this story up? What's their evidence?
Well, they focus heavily on O'Keefe's injuries, specifically cuts and abrasions they found on his arm. They argue these injuries just don't fit only being hit by an SUV. They suggest it looks more like he was in a physical fight. They even floated the idea that the Alberts dog might have been involved somehow in causing those arm injuries.
Interesting. And they emphasize that multiple people were confirmed to be inside that house. Brian Albert, Colin Albert, Jennifer McCabe.
Yeah, underlining that there were other people present when, according to the defense, things went wrong inside.
And then there's that Google search. That's become a huge point of contention, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Jennifer McCabe's alleged Google search for, and it was apparently misspelled, Hossalong to die in cold.
Right.
The defense claims their data shows this search happened hours before O'Keefe's body was officially found.
Which, if true, would be pretty damning. It suggests she knew he was outside, in danger, much earlier.
Exactly. It directly challenges the prosecution's timeline and McCabe's own account of when she made that search. It implies prior knowledge.
Okay, what else is the defense arguing?
The taillight pieces, they don't just say they're irrelevant, they argue they were planted.
Planted. How?
They claim the pieces were put near the body after Reed's SUV was already parked back at O'Keefe's house later that morning. They question the timing of the police finding those fragments, suggesting it doesn't add up.
Wow, okay. That's a serious claim against the investigation itself.
And that leads into their allegations against the lead investigator, State Trooper Michael Proctor.
Right, I remember hearing about this. They claim he had personal ties to the Albert family.
Yes, that he was friends with them, knew them socially. They argue this created a conflict of interest, a bias that tainted the investigation from the start.
And weren't there some text messages mentioned?
Mm-hmm. Allegedly inappropriate, derogatory texts sent by Proctor about Karen Reed during the investigation. The defense used these to try and show his alleged bias against her.
So they're attacking the integrity of the lead investigator and the process.
Definitely. And they've also raised concerns about phone data, things like potentially deleted calls or texts among some of the people involved, suggesting maybe evidence was tampered with or hidden.
Okay, so if you put the defense's whole narrative together, it's a fight inside the house. O'Keefe gets injured, maybe fatally. His body is moved outside. The scene is staged to look like a hit and run.
And then law enforcement, potentially led by a biased investigator with ties to the people inside, helps solidify that false narrative, framing Karen Reed.
It's a much more complex and frankly darker narrative involving conspiracy and cover-up.
Absolutely. A far cry from the prosecution's impaired driving accident scenario.
And a lot of the court battle, certainly up to early May 2025, really seemed to zero in on these specific points of contested evidence and the actions of these key figures.
For sure. Like those taillight pieces. The defense really hammered on the timing discrepancies they saw in the police reports.
What kind of discrepancies were they pointing to, specifically?
Things like exactly when different officers recorded finding the fragments, how the location was initially documented relative to the body. Minor inconsistencies that the defense argued added up to something suspicious.
Suggesting it wasn't as straightforward a discovery as the prosecution claimed.
Right. Raising doubt, suggesting the possibility it wasn't found organically, maybe pointing towards planting.
And Jennifer McKay's Google search that was subjected to intense scrutiny during her testimony, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. She reportedly testified she made this search after the body was found, prompted by Reed's distress or questions.
But the defense claimed they had digital data showing otherwise.
Yeah, they presented forensic data analysis that they argued proved the search happened much earlier, like around 2:30 a.m., hours before the official discovery around 6 a.m.
And if they could prove that earlier time definitively in court, what would that mean legally?
Well, it could seriously damage McCabe's credibility as a witness. A jury might see it as evidence she knew O'Keefe was outside and in trouble long before she admitted, potentially implying involvement or, at minimum, awareness and a failure to act or tell the truth initially. It shifts focus.
Okay. And Trooper Proctor, the cross-examination about his connections in those texts must have been pretty intense.
It was. The defense grilled him on his relationship with the Alberts, suggesting it compromised his objectivity from the very beginning.
How did they argue that bias specifically affected the investigation? What did they claim he did or didn't do because of it?
They argued it led to sort of tunnel vision, that Proctor and potentially others under him immediately focused on Reed because of this bias, ignoring other leads, not questioning the Alberts or McCabe thoroughly enough, maybe downplaying evidence that didn't fit the hit-and-run theory. Essentially, that the investigation wasn't aimed at finding the truth, but confirming Reed's guilt.
And the phone data you mentioned, analysis of cell records and tower data, both sides were using that, right?
Yes, trying to pinpoint people's locations, communication patterns, trying to make it fit their timeline. But the defense added that layer of suspicion with claims of deleted calls or texts.
If they could prove calls were deliberately deleted, what impact might that have?
It could definitely look bad to a jury. Deleting relevant communications around the time of a death investigation? Well, it suggests concealment, doesn't it? It could lend weight to the defense's cover-up theory, though context would be key.
And then, layered on top of all this, is the news of a separate federal investigation.
Right, that's a significant development. Reports surfaced that federal authorities started looking into how the state and local law enforcement handled the initial investigation into O'Keefe's death.
Now, just because there's a federal probe doesn't automatically mean the defense is right about everything.
No, absolutely not. An investigation isn't proof of wrongdoing itself, but...
But the fact that it's happening does add a certain weight, doesn't it? It suggests someone at a high level had enough concerns about potential misconduct or irregularities to warrant a federal look.
Exactly. It lends credibility, at least in the public eye, to the questions being raised about the original investigation's integrity.
And what could be the outcome if that federal investigation does find misconduct?
It could be huge. Depending on what they find, if anything, it could potentially lead to things like evidence being thrown out, it could bolster appeals, maybe even influence the current trial's outcome if findings emerged mid-trial, or potentially lead to separate charges against others. At minimum, it casts a shadow.
Which takes us right into the trial itself, unfolding in Dedham, Massachusetts, through early May 2025. It was drawing massive attention, media, public.
Huge crowds, yeah. You saw the pictures.
And the trial itself sounded incredibly complex. You had detailed, sometimes conflicting forensic evidence, witness testimonies that didn't always line up,
Yeah.
and these really serious allegations against the police.
Definitely. Reports from the courtroom described, that intense cross-examination of Jennifer McCabe about the Google search timing, with the defense showing their digital evidence.
Right.
You had forensic experts testifying about the taillight plastic, where it might have come from, how it broke, and Trooper Proctor on the stand facing tough questions about those texts and his connections.
It really felt like a courtroom battleground for these two completely opposing realities.
Exactly. The prosecution trying to build their case step by step. Reed was driving, she was impaired, she hit O'Keefe, she left. Prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
While the defense was simultaneously trying to dismantle that case piece by piece, challenging the evidence, questioning witness credibility, and actively building their alternative narrative of a frame-up.
Pushing the idea that others were responsible, that Reed was the scapegoat. It put the jury in an incredibly difficult position, sorting through all that complexity and emotion.
Yeah, it makes you think about, about the masks people might wear in situations like this.
How so?
Well, take Karen Reed. Is her public face, her defense strategy, a mask for guilt for panic after a horrible accident like the prosecution suggests? Or is it, as the defense argues, the forced composure of an innocent person fighting a massive conspiracy?
That's a stark contrast. And you could ask the same about the investigation itself, couldn't you? Was it purely objective truth-seeking? Or was it masking, maybe, incompetence? Or confirmation bias? Or, going further, was it masking a deliberate cover-up like the defense claims?
Right. And what about the role of community? Loyalty, especially in tight-knit groups. Could close relationships, personal loyalties be masking certain truths, influencing how people acted, what they said, what they maybe didn't say, consciously or not?
It raises difficult questions about how relationships might impact the pursuit of justice.
Ultimately, it all comes back to that central mystery, doesn't it? What really happened on Fairview Road in those early morning hours? With such conflicting stories and contested facts, the truth feels, hidden, very hard to discern.
Incredibly elusive.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, looking at the Karen Reed case as of early May 2025, it's clear it's just a profoundly polarizing and incredibly complex legal fight.
No easy answers in sight. You have the prosecution's hit-and-run theory clashing directly with the defense's detailed allegations of conspiracy and a cover-up involving multiple people, potentially including law enforcement.
And the questions the defense has raised about how evidence was handled, about potential conflicts of interest, about witness credibility, they've undeniably sparked a much bigger public conversation, haven't they?
They really have. It's brought up some uncomfortable but important discussions about trust in the justice system, about investigative procedures, especially when the stakes are this high.
And amidst all the legal strategy and the public fascination, we absolutely have to remember the human tragedy at the core of this. John O'Keefe lost his life.
A terrible loss.
And regardless of how the legal process ends, the pain for his family and also for Karen Reed's family going through this public ordeal is immense.
It's a powerful reminder, really, of how difficult finding truth and achieving justice can be, especially when narratives collide so fiercely under such intense scrutiny. We really encourage you, the listener, to think about these conflicting accounts, weigh the questions raised, and keep following the case through reliable public information as it continues to develop.